Jacob is mentioned for the first time in the Bible in Genesis 25. When Rebekah, Jacob's mother, was pregnant with him and his fraternal twin Esau, she asked God why her two babies were fighting in her womb. God responded that the animosity between the two brothers foreshadowed the two nations that would emerge from them. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. How is Jacob's character depicted in the Bible? Jacob was associated with trickery and deception from his birth until his wrestling match with God. Genesis 32, verses 24 to 29. Jacob's most infamous deceptions were committed against his twin brother Esau. This resulted in Esau wanting to slay his younger brother, so Jacob fled. On his way to his mother's homeland, he saw angels and a ladder to heaven. When Jacob arrives in Haran, he meets his match in the form of his uncle Laban. When Laban heard of the arrival of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced and kissed him and brought him to his house. Then he told Laban all these things. When Laban said to him, "You are my bone and my flesh," and Jacob stayed with him a month. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Just because you are my relative, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be?" Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, "I will serve you as a hired workman for 7 years in return for the privilege of marrying Rachel, your younger daughter." Laban said, "It is better that I give her in marriage to you than give her to another man. Stay and work with me." Finally, Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my time of service is completed, so that I may take her to me as my wife." Despite his feelings for Laban's younger daughter, Rachel, Jacob is duped into marrying her older sister, Leah. Jacob, on the other hand, perseveres and is eventually able to marry the object of his affections. Jacob worked for Laban for many years. Jacob was able to take much of Laban's herd for himself, thanks to God's protection and Jacob's intelligence. Finally, God tells Jacob to return to his father's land. The problem is that this means Jacob will have to confront Esau. Will his brother's rage remain unquenched after all these years? Knowing Jacob's story means knowing that his life was full of ups and downs. Despite God's promise to Jacob that through him would come not only a great nation, but a whole company of nations, he was a fearful and anxious man. Jacob was about to meet his brother Esau, who had vowed to kill him at a critical juncture in his life. All of Jacob's struggles and fears were about to come true. Jacob had fled Laban, enraged by his father-in-law's treatment, only to be met by his enraged brother Esau. His family history had been difficult enough. Wrestling with God himself was an entirely different matter. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Jacob had struggled his entire life. Even at the time of his birth, he was at odds with Esau. Later, he clashed with Laban. Yet, just before meeting Esau, Jacob went through the most difficult time of his life. He who had once grasped his brother's heel now clung to the living God's bodily form. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Note that Jacob is 79 years old at this point in the narrative. As a result, He is unlikely to pose a physical challenge to an angel. Though there is no reason to doubt that a physical contest takes place, we must not mistake that for the main point. When the text tells us that Jacob's opponent cannot overcome him, it is not suggesting that Jacob is physically besting the man. The ease with which he inflicts physical damage on Jacob indicates that any inability must be in the spiritual arena, not the physical one. If the wrestler is unable to spiritually defeat Jacob, it is because Jacob is unwilling to yield. Only when the man threatens to leave without offering assurances of God's assistance does Jacob demonstrate his willingness to negotiate on the critical issues. The turning point occurs when Jacob informs the stranger that he will not release him unless such assurances are provided. This, I believe, indicates Jacob's willingness to submit to God's demands on him. Jacob's perseverance is now working in his favor. He is willing to go to any length. The blessing manifests itself in the form of a name change. This is significant for Jacob because his name has become synonymous with his character throughout the story. A name change thus denotes a change in character. Changing someone's name was a way to exert authority over them. Jacob accepts the name change, which is equivalent to accepting a change in character in this case. The new name is intended to represent the transformation of one of Jacob's traditional strengths. His perseverance has brought him success in his interactions with people, and it is now responsible for his success in his struggle with God, not because God has surrendered, but because Jacob has conceded. As is customary with God, one must first lose in order to win. It's possible that Jacob's request for the wrestler's name is a last-ditch effort to maintain control, but the wrestler refuses. Who exactly is this stranger? Throughout the episode, the narrator refers to him as a man, at the end of the episode as Elohim. The man injures Jacob's hip, but he refuses to let go until the man blesses him. Jacob realized he wasn't wrestling a man, but God, and he wouldn't let go until he blessed him. The location of the wrestling match is named Peniel, which means face of God in Hebrew. Here are takeaways from Jacob's wrestling match with God. First, we need forgiveness, and it only comes by the mercy of God. Jacob was responsible for what he did to Esau, and he knew it. Jacob had relied on his own wits for success up until this point, but now he didn't know what would happen. His survival was contingent on his brother forgiving him for his wrongdoings. Although Jacob had no control over his brother's heart, there was one who did. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Genesis 32, verse 24. It was time for Jacob to realize that he couldn't rely on his own strength any longer. He had no control over the forgiveness he needed to survive. If we are to follow God, we must first admit our flaws and weaknesses. Only God's mercy can forgive us, and only God's grace can see us through to the other side of the night.